Next, a hearing on the president's authority to order the use of nuclear weapons. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee heard testimony on the procedures currently in place and legislation that would require congressional approval to use those weapons. This is 2 hours and 10 minutes.
The Senate Foreign Relations business meeting will come to order. We're going to do just a little bit of business on the front end and hopefully take care of some business quickly. I know people have other meetings, and then we're going to move to the hearing itself. We do thank our witnesses for allowing us to do this, and we're glad you're here. We have a number of items on the agenda today. We will move a number of nominations and Foreign Service Officer list. We will also take up S-1928, the Multilateral Aid Review Act of 2017. I want to thank Senator Coons for his leadership and hard work on this bill. I want to also recognize Senators Isaacson, Rubio, Young, Kane, and Merkley for their contributions to this important bipartisan legislation before our committee. This bill would establish a process for conducting objective reviews on how well multilateral institutions carry out their missions with our funding. The authorities sunset after 4 review periods in 11 years. Through this process, we will be able to evaluate their performance in an objective way. The review will look at performance, management, accountability and transparency, alignment with U.S. foreign policy goals, and efficiency. The U.S. spent around $11 billion to support the work of these entities, and we owe the U.S. taxpayers good value for their money. These reviews will help us make better informed decisions about how to prioritize scarce resources. It will also provide solid grounds for advocating for changes and reforms. Others, such as the United Kingdom and Australia, have done similar reviews of their multilateral and contributions with good results, by the way, multilateral aid contributions with good results. I urge you to support this effort to promote greater accountability for our spending on multilateral entities. Senator Cardin, do you have any comments you wish to make?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chairman. But before I comment on the bill and nominations that are on our agenda, I want to comment regarding information statistics regarding the Foreign Service that has been made public over the last week. Ambassador Barbara Stevenson of the American Foreign Service Association stated last week that, and I quote, "There is no denying that our leadership ranks are being depleted at a dizzying speed, due in part to decision to slash promotion numbers by more than half. The Foreign Service Officer Corps at State has lost 60% of its career ambassadors since January. Ranks of the career ministers, our 3-star equivalents, are down from 33 to 19. The ranks of our 2-star ministers, counselors, have fallen from 431 after Labor Day to 369 today and are still falling. Ambassador Stevenson, who is the president of the governing board of the AFSA, is imploring us to ask why. Well, I feel like I have been asking why of the administration and the State Department on a lot of issues lately, including the myriad personnel, budget, and reorganization matters. I'm not getting a lot of answers. Just as one small example, although the Trump administration lifted the federal hiring freeze in April of 2017, the State Department and the USAID has elected to keep its own hiring freeze in place. Why? My impression is that the morale is at an all-time low at the State Department and USAID, causing a massive exodus of diplomatic and development expertise. Why is this happening? And what is the department's leadership doing about it? Our president said recently that we do not need to worry about the fact that many of the senior level positions at the State Department remain unfilled, because when it comes to foreign policy, his opinion is the only one that matters. Why on earth would he say that? For the thousands of FSOs around the world working to advance the ideals of the United States, this was a horrible message. If this is the sort of high-level decapitation of leadership we're going on at the Defense Department, with 3- and 4-star officers resigning and younger officers and enlisted personnel suffering low morale and leaving as well, or not even signing up, I can guarantee you that Congress would be up in arms. Yet here, there is silence. Why? The State Department and USAID, I would offer, are every bit as vital and critical an element to our national security as the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, our law enforcement, and a myriad of others in the federal government who work tirelessly every day to protect our security, extend our prosperity, and promote our values. Folks, this situation is alarming. We put our country in danger when we do not have adequate voice and resources to all of our country's national security tools. Secretary Madeleine Albright once said, "In turbulent and perilous world, the men and women of Foreign Service are the front lines every day on every continent for us." This committee needs to continue to press this issue. It's our responsibility to make sure that we have the diplomatic assets in place in order to represent our national security. Moving to the legislative item, I want to thank Senator Corker and Coons for their efforts on this bill. The multilateral institutions are a critical part of our foreign assistance efforts. They help us coordinate activities, leverage funds, and advance our national interests and values. If successful, the Multilateral Aid Review Act will provide us with clear metrics, reliable data, and solid analysis of our multilateral investments. Mr. Chairman, I hope every member of the committee will read the bill, because I think it does spell out what our expectations are in regards to carrying out mission, the right use of resources, and that we review this on a periodic basis so that we make sure that our multilateral efforts are in our national security interests. I think this is an important bill, and I applaud you for your work. One last point, if I might. I know we have a quorum, but one last point. We're getting near the end of this work period. We only have one more work period remaining before we adjourn for the year. There is an extremely important bill that Senator Rubio and Baldwin have been working on, the JUST Act, which will require additional State Department reporting on European government efforts to return or provide restitution for property wrongly seized during the Holocaust. I've said this before, but time's running out on this issue as people are getting much older, fewer are surviving, and it's becoming much more difficult to deal with restitution. I really applaud the work that was done on this bill. I know that there are many members of this committee that are co-sponsors, including Senator Johnson, Young, Booker, Coons, Menendez, and Markey. And I would just urge the Democrat and Republican staff to try to get together with the sponsors to see whether we cannot move this bill through our committee this year. And I appreciate the chairman's attention.
Thank you. I'd like to ask if it's possible, because I know we have conflicts taking place at 10:15, if we could go ahead and move through the business. If people want to make comments afterwards, I'm glad to hear it. And obviously, we're going to have a long hearing. Let me just say, we had a very unsatisfactory meeting last week with the State Department. Our two staffs did. I think the concerns about the State Department are bipartisan in nature. I don't think they're anywhere close to having a plan to present relative to the reforms they want to make there. And I do think that we need to be much more focused on holding them accountable, because I think many of the things that you said, if not all, but many of them anyway, are very true. With that, I understand that Mr. Ulen, for the Undersecretary of State Management, has been held over, and he'll be considered in the next business meeting. I would entertain a motion to approve the remaining nominations en bloc by voice vote, including Ms. Lisa Johnson, Mr. Sean Lawler, Mr. Steve Goldstein, Ms. Rebecca Gonzalez, and 2 Foreign Service officer lists. Unless there's so moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Are there any recorded noes that any individuals would like on any of these nominations? Seeing none, the ayes have it, and the nominations and promotions are agreed to. Next, we'll move to S 1928. First, I would entertain a motion to approve the substitute amendment and the Portman amendment en bloc by voice vote.
So moved.
So moved. Is there a second? So moved and seconded. The questions on the motion to approve the substitute amendment and the Portman amendment en bloc. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? With that, the ayes have it. The amendments are agreed to. Are there any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the work of the Committee on the Multilateral Aid Review Act of 2017. I have 2 amendments here. I'd like to thank Senator Rubio for joining me as a co-sponsor of both of these amendments. One addresses the issue of Taiwan. It talks about using the United States voice and our vote in international organizations to make sure that we're advocating for the addition of Taiwan as an observer to such organizations and entities. We did it last year with Interpol, and I believe we should stand up for Taiwan as a great partner and especially an important voice in these international organizations. The other amendment is addressing North Korea, and in a meeting that Senator Markey and I hosted with a former resident of North Korea, a high-level defector, the deputy ambassador to United Kingdom, has said that the one thing that could make a difference in North Korea is cutting off diplomatic relations with North Korea, other nations around the globe that haven't done that yet, and isolating diplomatically North Korea as much as possible. And so this amendment would use our voice and vote in international organizations and entities to do just that, to make sure that we are stressing the importance of diplomatic isolation of the North Korean regime. And I think these 2 amendments present a very significant contrast, because you have Taiwan, somebody that we want to partner with, somebody that is an incredible partner, somebody who abides by and respects the rule of law, that cannot participate in these international organizations. And then you have one, North Korea, that has been sanctioned almost greater than any other nation on the face of this planet by the United States, and yet they're allowed to be in the United Nations. They're allowed to be a full part of the diplomatic community. And so I think this is just a good contrast, where why is the nation that's testing nuclear bombs in violation of every sanction possible being treated better than Taiwan, that is a great international partner? So I'm going to withdraw these 2 amendments for the sake of moving forward on 1928, but I do think it's important that we continue this conversation. I thank you for the work you've been doing on this legislation.
Well, thank you, and I do want to point out that as a new member on this committee, you passed one of the most meaningful pieces of legislation ever has been passed on North Korea. I know we've had legislation that has passed since that time, and I know there's a banking committee piece that has passed out on sanctions. I understand you're working very closely with us and with the sponsors of that bill to add your language there, and I just want to thank you for being so focused on that part of the world and your leadership of that committee. And thank you for withdrawing these so that we can work constructively towards another end on the bill I'm talking about. Is there a motion to approve the legislation as amended? So moved. Is there a second? So moved and second. The questions on the motion to approve S. 1928 as amended. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? With that, the ayes have it. The legislation as amended is agreed to. That completes the committee's business. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes. Without objection, so ordered. And with that, the committee stands adjourned exactly at 10:15, as we said. We will see Finance Committee members later. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
If I could just briefly thank you for working with me on this bill. Thank Senator Cardin, and thank everybody who's been a co-sponsor. We spend $10 billion a year on the United Nations, World Bank, and a lot of other organizations, and I appreciate this approach, and I appreciate Senator Merkley's amendment that'll make the whole methodology more transparent. I think we have to continue on a bipartisan way to work to make sure that what foreign aid we are investing is done well and wisely, and I appreciate the opportunity to work together on the bill.
Well, I appreciate being able to work with you on this, and I think people understand, too, this also gives us the ability with this data to strongly support those agencies that we believe ought to be strongly supported if they're producing good results. So
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
So with that, we will now move to the hearing. The hearing itself will actually come to order. We thank General Kaler, Dr. Fever, and Mr. McKeon for joining us today and for sitting through the business meeting over the last 15 minutes. A number of members on both sides of the aisle of this on and off the committee have raised questions about the executive's authorities with respect to war making and the use of nuclear weapons, and from a diplomatic perspective, entering into and terminating agreements with other countries. As I've mentioned publicly, this is one in a series of hearings where our committee will examine all of these issues, but today it's my hope that we will remain focused on the topic at hand, the authority and the process for the use of nuclear weapons. The Congressional Research Service tells us this is the first time that the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate or House has met on this topic since 1976, 41 years ago. Making the decision to go to war of any sort is a heavy responsibility for our nation's elected leaders, and the decision to use nuclear weapons is the most consequential of all. The Atomic Energy Act of 1946 and the subsequent practices recognize that the use of nuclear weapons must be subject to political control. This is why no general or admiral or defense secretary has the authority to order the use of nuclear weapons. Only the President, the elected political leader of the United States, has this authority. The nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War dramatically elevated the risk of nuclear conflict. As the Soviets developed massive numbers of nuclear weapons and the systems to develop them to the United States, to deliver them to the United States, we planned for the unthinkable, how to get our missiles in the air within those few minutes before their warheads could hit us and possibly destroy our ability to respond. In that kind of scenario, there's no time for debate. Having such forces at the ready has been successful in deterring such an attack, and for that we are grateful. But this process means the President has the sole authority to give that order, whether we are responding to a nuclear attack or not. Once that order is given and verified, there is no way to revoke it. To be clear, I would not support changes that would reduce our deterrence of adversaries or reassurance of our allies. But I would like to explore, as our predecessors in the House did 41 years ago, the realities of this system. I want to thank all of our distinguished witnesses and the members of this committee for the seriousness with which they approached this topic before us today, and hope that together we can have a productive and enlightening discussion about this sober issue. And with that, I'd like to turn to my friend and our distinguished ranking member, Senator Cardin.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I almost always, in a perfunctory way, thank you for holding hearings, but in this case, I really do believe this is a critically important discussion to have, not just with ourselves in the United States Senate, but with the American people. I must tell you, I am always amazed as to what subjects come up at town hall meetings that I hold throughout Maryland. Most of the subjects deal with the local economic or domestic issues. We don't normally get a lot of foreign policy questions at town hall meetings, but of late, I've been getting more and more questions about, can the President really order a nuclear attack without any controls? That question is asked more and more by the American people. And of course, it's fueled by comments made by President Trump in regards to North Korea. Quoting the President in his August interview, North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. Or the President's comments, will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Now, many interpret that to mean that the President is actively considering the use of nuclear weapons in order to deal with the threat of North Korea. That is frightening. And as the chairman pointed out, based on my understanding of the nuclear command and control protocols, there are no checks on the President's authority. The system, as it is set up today, provides the President with the sole and ultimate authority to use nuclear weapons. And that was developed because of the realities of the security of our country. The nuclear command and control system we have in place is the result of three factors. The first was that the particular threat and challenge of the Cold War. For decades, the United States faced a nuclear-armed adversary in the Soviet Union with a large and capable nuclear force. The United States settled upon a strategy of mutual assured destruction, which placed distinctive commands on our nuclear warfighting command and control system. The second, and a related factor, is the law of physics. An ICBM launch from Russia to the United States would have about a 30-minute flight time. There wasn't time to convene a special session of Congress or to have the type of consultations that would infringe upon our ability to have actually a deterrent. This means the President and his team have an incredibly short window to identify, assess, communicate, decide, and if necessary, launch a nuclear force. There was no time for cabinet meetings and no time for consultation. The Cold War may be long behind us, but such a scenario, based upon the need to deter a massive Soviet nuclear attack with little or no warning time, remains the driving force behind the current command and control architecture even today. The final factor behind U.S. nuclear command and control system rests with the fact that nuclear weapons, ever since their development, have always been considered unique, not like any other military weapon. Starting under President Truman, the point was made crystal clear that the White House was in charge of the atomic bomb and its uses, not the military. Nuclear bombs were not a military weapon whose use would be controlled by the armed forces, but a strategic weapon under the strict control of civilian and elected officials. The President, as both our highest elected civilian official and Commander-in-Chief under the Constitution, played a unique role with this unique weapon. The President, and only the President, assumed the sole and unchecked power to launch nuclear attacks. As President Truman said, you have got to understand that this isn't a military weapon. It is used to wipe out women and children and unarmed people, and not for military uses. So we have got to treat this thing differently from rifles and cannons and ordinary things like that. Nuclear weapons remain unique, but today we face a different question than the one we faced during the Cold War. Given today's challenges, we need to revisit this question on whether a single individual should have the sole and unchecked authority to launch a nuclear attack under all circumstances, including the right to use it as a first strike. The most likely attack we face is not a massive surprise nuclear attack by Russia or China, but a nuclear conflict that springs from an escalating conflict with the smaller nuclear forces such as North Korea. In this sort of circumstance, where the United States would not face the same sort of use them or lose them pressure we faced during the Cold War, it may be possible and certainly wise for the President to take the time to consult Congress before the profound and historic decision to use nuclear weapons is made. I would like to be able to tell my constituents and the American people we have a system in place that prevents an impulsive and irrational decision to use nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, I cannot make that assurance today. I look forward to hearing from our three very distinguished witnesses. I just would like to acknowledge Mr. McKinnon's presence here as a former counsel to this committee under Senator Biden. It's nice to have him back before our committee.
Thank you so much. Our first witness today is General Bob Kaler, Commander of the United States Strategic Command from 2011 to 2013. Thank you for being back with us today, and thank you for your service to our country. Our second witness is Dr. Peter Feaver, Professor of Political Science at Duke University. Thank you so much for being here today. Our third witness is Dr. Brian McKeon, the Acting Undersecretary of Defense for Policy during the Obama administration, and once a staff member, as was mentioned on this committee. Thank you for coming back. If all of you are very familiar, if you could summarize your comments in about 5 minutes, we would appreciate that. Any written materials you have without objection will be entered into the record, and if you could just begin and proceed in the order introduced, we would appreciate it.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Senator Cardin, distinguished members of the committee. It's my honor to appear today to discuss nuclear decision-making. I'm also really pleased to appear with these two outstanding panelists and colleagues to my right. Command and control is a critically important component of our nuclear deterrent, and I applaud you for taking the time to understand it better. At the outset, I must say that the views I expressed this morning are mine. I no longer represent the Department or Strategic Command or the U.S. Air Force. I will try to bring the perspective of almost 4 decades of military service and senior military command to my remarks today, and much of that was in nuclear-related duty. Let me also add that some of the nation's most closely guarded secrets are associated with nuclear weapons, with the plans associated with them, and with the processes as well. So there are limits on what I can say, even if some aspects of this matter are discussed openly by others. In the interest of time, I'd like to make just 3 brief opening remarks. First, as this committee knows well, the U.S. now faces more complex security problems and greater uncertainty than it did during the Cold War. Nuclear weapons are not gone from world affairs, and it doesn't look to me like they're going to be gone from world affairs anytime soon. Russia and China are modernizing their forces as the basis of strategies designed to expand their positions at our expense and the expense of our allies. Russia frequently makes explicit nuclear threats, to include the threat of nuclear first use. China will soon deploy ballistic missile submarines, opening a new chapter in their nuclear history. North Korea threatens our regional allies and forward-based forces and is pursuing the capability to threaten the U.S. directly. North Korea has also threatened nuclear first use. Iran, of course, remains a country of interest. Other strategic threats like long-range conventional weapons, cyber weapons, and threats against critical space assets have emerged and can arrive at our doorstep quickly, but nuclear weapons remain important in the strategies of our potential adversaries. The second point, while the U.S. nuclear force is far smaller, postured less aggressively, and occupies a less prominent place in our defense strategy than it did during the Cold War, nuclear deterrence remains crucial to our defense and to strategic stability. There's an old saying that I've used many times over the years that deterrence exists when an adversary believes they can't achieve their objectives, will suffer unacceptable consequences if they try, or both. U.S. nuclear weapons prevent the coercive or actual use of these weapons against us and our allies, which is their primary purpose, constrain the scope and scale of conflict, compel adversaries to ponder the consequences of their actions before they act, and obviate the need for additional allies to acquire their own. No other weapon can replace the deterrent value of nuclear weapons and the ability to command and control our nuclear forces under all conditions of crisis and conflict remains central to the credibility of the deterrent. Third, U.S. nuclear forces operate under strict civilian control. Only the President of the United States can order the employment of U.S. nuclear weapons, and the President's ability to exercise that authority and direction is ensured by people, processes, and capabilities that comprise the nuclear command and control system. This is a system controlled by human beings. Nothing happens automatically. That system is designed to do 2 very important things. First, it's designed to enable the authorized use of nuclear weapons while preventing the unauthorized use or the accidental use or the inadvertent use of them. And 2, to do so in the face of a wide variety of scenarios, including a nuclear attack. And the challenge of the Cold War, which is a short-notice massive attack, while less likely today, I would agree, still exists. A colleague and mentor of mine has always said that when you're looking at an adversary, you have to look at capability and intent. The Russians may not have the intent of attacking us today with a short-notice massive attack, but they retain the capability to do so, and so long as they do, we have to deter that capability. The nuclear decision process includes assessment, review, and consultation between the President and key civilian and military leaders, followed by transmission and implementation of any presidential decision by the forces themselves. All activities surrounding nuclear weapons are characterized by layers of safeguards, tests, and reviews. Finally, I think it's important to remember that the United States military doesn't blindly follow orders. A presidential order to employ U.S. nuclear weapons must be legal. The basic legal principles of military necessity, distinction, and proportionality apply to nuclear weapons just as they do to every other weapon. It was my job and the job of other senior leaders like the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman and the other combatant commanders to make sure these principles were applied to nuclear orders. As I close, I want to urge caution as you consider these matters. Changes or conflicting signals can have profound implications for deterrence, for extended deterrence, and for the confidence of the men and the women in the nuclear forces. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate being here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Fever.
So, Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, and distinguished members of the committee, Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this important topic, which I will refer to as nuclear command and control. My bottom line is simple. In the past, Congress has played a vital role in pushing the executive branch to strengthen command and control, and the time may be ripe for another close look. However, we must proceed with some caution because the topic is complex and susceptible to unintended consequences. I'll make 4 points. First, at the heart of nuclear command and control is what might be called the always-never dilemma. For nuclear deterrence to work, we must have a high assurance that the country will always be able to present a credible nuclear strike capability to our adversaries, even in the most dire scenarios. However, because even a single nuclear detonation would be so consequential and might trigger an escalatory spiral that would lead to civilization-threatening outcomes, we must also have a high assurance that there will never be an accidental or unauthorized use of nuclear weapons. The challenge is that measures designed to improve the always side of the equation can compromise the negative side and vice versa. Pre-delegating the authority to use nuclear weapons and spreading that capability to do so to lower echelons may thwart an enemy's first strike planning, for example, but it would increase the risk that a weapon might be used in an unauthorized fashion or by someone confused in the fog of battle. The history of nuclear command and control is a history of civilian and military leaders debating the proper balance between always and never. It is a history of occasional discoveries that the risks on one side or the other side of the ledger were greater than originally understood. And it is a history of improvements, some like permissive action links, PALs, which are coded locks that blocked detonation of a weapon without inserting the PIN code and were pressed by far-seeing congressional advocates. These improvements that may have helped forestall disaster. This brings me to my second major point. We must be willing to invest the requisite funds to keep our technology up to date. But in the nuclear command and control business, hardware is trumped by software, and software is trumped by wetware. Hardware refers to the technologies like the PALs I just mentioned. Software refers to the rules and procedures that govern how the hardware is used. For instance, the code management system that determines who has the PAL codes and who's authorized to release them. Wetware refers to the human element, the reliability of people involved in enforcing the rules, and the civil-military relations that form the political context in which the software and hardware operate. At the end of the day, what would matter most is the human element. Would the President's advisors be in a position to provide timely counsel, and would that counsel shape the President's decisions? Would the various echelons in the chain of command recognize a valid authenticated nuclear use order as being legal, given the military's deeply ingrained training to refuse to implement any illegal order? Indeed, would subordinate elements of the command and control system do what they're supposed to do, no more and no less, but with appropriate judgment? This last point cannot be overemphasized. For decades now, it's been technically possible to build a nuclear command and control system that would eliminate the human element altogether. Every generation of strategic leaders has understood that such a system would be foolhardy in the extreme. The human element introduces risks, to be sure, but it also introduces the opportunity to mitigate risks. This brings me to my third major point. The best reforms to nuclear command and control would be ones that maximize the opportunity for the human element to mitigate risks by maximizing time for deliberation and assessment. Of course, efforts to extend decision times must not run afoul of the always-never dilemma. I conclude with my fourth and final point. The time is ripe for a fresh look. Changes in communications technology and rapidly evolving cyber threats alone would justify a fresh examination. Threats that were warned about 5 years ago have become urgent realities today. And finally, our divisive political environment has raised new doubts about the effectiveness of all our branches of government to wield the power they possess responsibly. In that context, a thoroughgoing review of nuclear command and control could help shore up nuclear confidence in this area. Outside experts have suggested many possible improvements that are worth considering. For instance, there are a variety of proposals that involve requiring certifications by additional cabinet officials of launch orders under certain circumstances. However, all of these proposals raise important constitutional questions about usurping the President's authorities. Because the actual operations of the current system are exceedingly complex, I would recommend great caution before legislating any particular fix. Nevertheless, I would recommend diligence and perseverance in oversight of the system to reassure our friends and to warn our enemies that the nuclear arsenal will function as it is intended. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. McKeon.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Cardin, members of the committee, thank you for your invitation to be here today. It's nice to be back in this room after spending so many years of my professional life working on the staff of this committee. And I'll digress briefly, Mr. Chairman, to say I'm very impressed by how quickly you mustered a quorum, having spent numerous hours waiting and waiting and waiting for that magic 10th senator to show up.
Thank you. It's one of the rare times that occurred. But
your
I'm glad
efficiency
you were
is
able to
impressive.
witness that, so thank you.
I'll briefly address 3 questions and try not to duplicate my colleagues. First, who has the authority to employ nuclear weapons? In one respect, the answer is simple. The President does. As Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces under the Constitution, he is the sole authority within the executive branch for such a decision. Some authority in military operations is delegated to the Secretary of Defense and then further delegated to appropriate combatant commanders. The authority to use nuclear weapons, however, remains with the President. That is as it should be in a republic, given the gravity of the decision and the consequences of any nuclear use. It bears emphasis that the President would not make this decision by himself. The system for decision is designed to ensure that the President consults with the National Security Council and his other senior civilian and military advisors, and I would expect that to occur in every case where the use of nuclear weapons is contemplated. That is hardly the end of the inquiry. The authority to employ nuclear weapons is closely intertwined with an equally momentous question: who has the authority to take the country to war? Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and several other powers with regard to supporting and regulating the armed forces. To the President, Article 2 provides he is the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy. The constitutional text, structure, and our history provide Congress with primacy in this sphere. This power is not merely limited to formal declarations of war, which Congress has not done since World War II, but to authorizing most uses of military force. To be sure, the President possesses the constitutional authority to defend against sudden attack or to preempt an imminent attack. But Article 2 does not give him carte blanche to take the country to war. In the modern era, presidents of both parties have often made broad assertions of authority to take military action without prior authorization by Congress in a manner that the framers would not have recognized. Nonetheless, we need not resolve this general debate to answer the specific question presented in today's world. In addition to the global terrorism challenge, our major potential adversaries today number on one hand Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. 3 of these countries possess nuclear weapons, and the 4th has pursued such a capability. Therefore, conflict with any of these states could conceivably involve nuclear weapons use. Direct armed conflict with these countries would undoubtedly be war in the constitutional sense if initiated by the Congress, and if initiated by the United States, would require authorization by the Congress. A recent executive branch opinion on the war power by the Office of Legal Counsel in 2011 supports this conclusion. It indicated that analysis of whether congressional authorization of a use of military force is required would turn on examination of, quote, the nature, scope, and duration, end quote, of the conflict, and that specific congressional approval would be necessary in cases of, quote, prolonged and substantial military engagements typically involving exposure of U.S. military personnel to significant risk over a substantial period of time, end of quote. It is hard to imagine an armed conflict scenario with any of these countries that would not meet that test. The rapid advances of North Korea's nuclear and missile program and the escalating rhetoric between the President and the North Korean leader are no doubt foremost in your minds. In the North Korean context, the view that Congress would need to authorize a war is buttressed by the recent letter to your House colleagues by the Vice Director of the Joint Staff, Rear Admiral Michael Dumont, where he stated that a ground invasion would be required in order to locate and destroy all components of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Given the high number of casualties that would occur in any conflict, with North Korea, let alone during a ground invasion, no reasonable argument can be made that that would not be war in the constitutional sense. The President and his senior administration officials have stated that time is running out to address the North Korean challenge, and in August, the National Security Advisor suggested the possibility of a preventive war. Such a war, as distinct from a preemptive strike in the face of impending attack, would also require congressional authorization. For context on these two questions, I would answer a third. What is the current policy on use of nuclear weapons? In my prepared statement, I highlight several elements of the results of the Nuclear Posture Review in 2010 and the presidential employment guidance issued in 2013, which remain in place while the Trump administration completes the Nuclear Posture Review ordered by the President in January. General Kaler has described some of these elements as well in his statement. Most important, the 2010 NPR set forth the goal of reducing the role of nuclear weapons in the U.S. national security strategy, and it's important to understand there's nothing in the current guidance that compels the use of nuclear weapons in a high-end conflict. Finally, I would note the Obama administration did not adopt a formal policy of no first use of nuclear weapons, although in the final month of the administration, Vice President Biden gave a speech in which he said that given our non-nuclear capabilities and the nature of today's threats, it is hard to envision a plausible scenario in which the first use of nuclear weapons would be necessary. He went on to say that he and the President were confident that we can deter and defend ourselves against and our allies against non-nuclear threats through other means. Closing, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank all three of you for that outstanding testimony. As usual, I'm going to reserve my time for interjections and turn to our ranking member.
Let me also thank all three of you, not just for your appearance here today, but for your service to our country on these very difficult issues. I'm going to preface my question with my strong belief that there is not a military solution to the crisis in North Korea, that any military option carries unbelievable risk factors, whether it be conventional or the use of nuclear weapons. And I hope that the President's trip to Asia has produced the openings towards a diplomatic surge that will recognize that both China and the United States should be looking for off-ramps to this crisis, and they have a lot in common, and China can change the equation in North Korea. So I hope that's where we are heading, because the use of any military option has extreme risks. So this is not a hypothetical discussion. What concerns me is that the President may be getting military options, and the use of conventional weapons could lead to extreme number of casualties in Japan or in South Korea. So there may be a discussion about whether a nuclear first strike could prevent that from occurring or have a less of a chance of that occurring. So it is not a hypothetical discussion. So, General, I was particularly impressed by your statement, which says, in addition, the legal principles of military necessity, distinction, and proportionality also apply to nuclear plans, operations, and decisions. So how is the President legally restrained, if at all, on the use of a nuclear first strike as a result of the orders that are there under command that it must be proportional, or that there's a distinction that requires this military necessity? Is there any real restraint on the President on choosing a nuclear first strike in a circumstance in North Korea?
Senator, I think there are. I think that there are always legal constraints when any military option is being considered. There's been a long-standing debate about nuclear weapons and morality and legality and where nuclear weapons fit in all of that, given that things changed in August of 1945. And there has been, I think, a long-standing policy view from the United States that nuclear weapons are not inherently illegal. They can be used illegally. The question is, under what circumstances and what situation? And what I can tell you is that when I was involved as the commander of STRATCOM in planning pre-planning options that we are ordered to do. The President directs, every President has directed the military to pre-plan some options, more as time has passed for additional flexibility, et cetera, et cetera. We involved our legal advisors in every step of that process.
So let me interrupt you there. So there is discussion taking place at the National Security Council level with legal advisors, with military advisors. And the advice is that under the guidelines on proportionality and necessity, that this is not appropriate for use of a nuclear first strike. Is there action that can be taken by those advisors if the President overrules that decision and says, no, we're going with a nuclear attack?
Other than to state their view about the legality of the move, the President retains constitutional authority to order some military action. The military, you would be in a very interesting constitutional situation, I believe, because again, the military is obligated to follow legal orders, but is not obligated to follow illegal orders. The question
Who would make that judgment on behalf of the operational command under DOD?
Well, it's one of the things that would be on the plate of the commander of Strategic Command. I always believed that that was on my plate, that ultimately it's very difficult.
So let me just drill down on this. If you believe that this did not meet the legal test of proportionality, even if ordered by the President of the United States to use a nuclear first strike, you believe that because of legalities, you retain that decision to disobey the Commander-in-Chief?
Yes. If there is an illegal order presented to the military is obligated to refuse to follow it. Now, the question is just the one that you described, is the process leading to that determination and how you arrive at that. And I would concede to you that that would be a very difficult process and a very difficult conversation. But in the scenario that you're painting here, I would also argue that there's time for that. There's time for that kind of a deliberate conversation on these matters.
And just to complete this cycle, part of this is the protocols that have been established under executive orders on the use of nuclear that require the proportionality that you're talking about. Others is the inherent responsibility of military command to follow only orders that are lawful. Am I reading that correct?
Right. Yes.
So there's two different sets, because you may very well be getting opinions from the commander from the White House that this is legal, but you would have to make your own independent judgment based upon history and based upon following only legal orders.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm going to use my first interjection here. So in the event someone in your former position received an order that you knew had not been vetted through the National Security Council, for instance, that discussions had not taken place, that just you got a call out of the blue, things were tense in a particular area, and you received that order, would you consider that to be legal or not legal?
I never felt, Senator, that I had to vet orders through the National Security Council. I felt, as a military senior leader, that I had three obligations. One obligation was to provide my military advice. One obligation was to raise any concerns that I had, if they happen to be legal concerns, to raise those concerns. And then the third obligation that I had was related to the legality of the order, either follow a legal order or refuse to follow a legal order. I had legal advisors myself. I fully expected that we would involve the Secretary's legal advisors, the Chairman's legal advisors. Where DOD took that from there, was sort of their issue to take. But this, I would certainly have been in consultation with the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman.
Senator Johnson.
General, I want to continue down along this line of questioning. From my standpoint, there's really two basic scenarios. The scenario when we are under imminent attack, or there's an attack that is imminent, and then one where it is more preemptive, where there is time. You said there's always going to be time. There may not always be time, correct?
No, I didn't mean to suggest that it would always be time. I agree with that.
So when the president would determine that we are under the threat of almost an imminent attack, he has almost absolute authority, correct?
Yes. Context matters here. And yes.
So is there any process to assess imminent at that moment?
So I'm a former commander, not a lawyer. So there's
I'm an accountant,
let me just say this, to try to shed some light on this. Context matters here. If, in fact, in a range of scenarios where nuclear weapon use is possible, or there's a potential for nuclear weapons use, U.S. policy has helped us clarify over the years under what circumstances we might expect to use nuclear weapons. So, for example, the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review said extreme circumstances when vital national interests are at stake. As a commander, I had that in my mind as a context for nuclear weapons. And if we had tactical warning that an attack was underway, then we were into a playbook, basically, that had been vetted for its legal viability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So we've somewhat defined imminent? I mean, obviously, if you see radar saying that
Absolutely.
missiles have launched, that's obviously imminent.
Right.
What if it's right before?
Well, there's also the conditions where you might have strategic warning, where we have solid warning that something will happen.
That's already game planned out in terms of what strategic warning is that would
Well,
say it was imminent?
it's not precisely defined, but I think it would be certainly one of those matters under consideration. Tactical warning, by the way, carries with it some amount of time urgency, either for the survival of the decision maker or for a decision about what to do in terms of responding. Strategic warning is not as time urgent. And so more time gets introduced into these scenarios as you go from the most extreme stressing scenario back to the left.
So that's the next scenario is where it's more strategic and you have time. And let's say you get a presidential order to launch.
Right.
But you're in the position and you know that it has not gone, you have not followed the process. It has not been properly vetted. In that case, in your position, you believe that is an illegal order?
No, I believe you have to determine whether that's illegal.
But you would have that, you believe that is your responsibility, and you have the authority to
Yes.
say this is not legal because we have not followed the steps, we haven't gone through the process.
I would have said, I have a question about this, and I would have said, I'm not ready to proceed.
And then what happens?
Well, as I say, I don't know exactly. No. Fortunately, these are all hypothetical scenarios. I mean, they're real in terms of our.
We're holding a hearing on this, so.
They're all, exactly. This is the human factor in our system. The human factor then kicks in. It's what Dr. Fever said. There's a human element to this. And at that point, I think, as with any military order, it doesn't matter really. The consequences are higher if it's an order on nuclear weapons, but it's the same principle on any order.
So the point is there's a lot of human intervention between a presidential order when there's time, it's not imminent, to really ask the questions, to lay out the fact we haven't gone through this process, this is not well thought out, it's not proportional, so we can have a little comfort that even though the president has the authority, there are limits to that even within this context when there is time.
I believe that's true, and even if time is compressed, there are circumstances that I could envision where I would have said the same thing, which is, wait, stop. We need to resolve these issues, or we need to address this question, or whatever. And the process provides for that in that it's ultimately an interaction among human beings. The decision authority resides with the president, however.
Thank you for those answers. Thanks for your service.
Yes, sir.
Let me just, before we move to the next, the person who's in your position as a Senate confirmed it's a Senate confirmed position, is that
Yes,
correct?
that's right.
And typically the person that's put in your position is recommended by the military or by the civil? How does it typically work?
Well, I can tell you how it worked for me. The Secretary of Defense, in my case, the Secretary of Defense interviewed a number of candidates, decided on a candidate to recommend to the President. There was a process that was gone through there at some level, and I became the President's nominee to the Senate, and then you all operated.
Most of the people who've ended up being in these positions, are they people that have moved up through the defense mechanisms solely? This is not a political position. Typically, it's a position that's based on merit.
It is not a political position, and it's a position that is based on, I believe, experience, and I would like to think merit as well, but certainly experience. Certainly, there are a lot of factors that go into selection for senior command. That's a great question, I think, for you to pose to other witnesses who have been in the position to select senior commanders. I was the beneficiary of that selection.
Mr. Chairman, I can tell you, at least from my vantage point in the Pentagon, but also as Chief of Staff to the National Security Council, the process General Kaler describes is the process the Secretary and the Chairman huddle and look at various candidates from the services for the 4-star combatant commands. And under President Obama, he personally interviewed most of the candidates who were recommended for selection.
And typically, Mr. Chairman, in recent years, the commanders of some of the combatant commanders have been typically 4 stars on their 2nd or 3rd assignment. So I was not a first-time 4-star when I was nominated to take command of Strategic Command. That was my 2nd 4-star assignment.
Thank you. Senator Udall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all the witnesses for being here today. The first use of U.S. nuclear weapons would appear to be a clear declaration of war. Certainly the recipient of a U.S. nuclear attack would perceive it that way. Under the U.S. Constitution, only Congress can declare war. Should Congress require the President to seek authorization for the first use of nuclear weapons? Why or why not? Mr. McKeon, why don't we start with you?
Well, Senator, as I laid out in my opening statement, it's my view, certainly if the United States were to initiate a war with another nuclear state and we conceive that the use of nuclear weapons might be possible, that's war in the constitutional sense that Congress should authorize. If we are under attack from a nuclear state using nuclear weapons, that's a different question, and the President would have the authority under Article 2 to respond, whether with a conventional or nuclear weapons. The hardest question is the in-between question, and what Senator Johnson was getting at is where do you define imminence on the continuum?
How do you define it?
Well, it would be very fact-specific, to give you a bit of a lawyer's dodge, but that kind of the most obvious case is we see a missile on a launch pad or several missiles on several launch pads, and we have good intelligence that they intend to not test them but launch them at the United States. That seems like a pretty clear case of imminence. And then you would move down a continuum away from that to where it becomes less imminent and looks more like a preventive attack.
Mr. Fever and General.
What I would say is distinguish between scenarios where the military wake up the president versus scenarios where the president's waking up the military. Where the military wakes up the president and warns him that there is about to be an attack or that we're experiencing an attack, in those settings, the president has a very limited time window to make a decision. He would make a decision. He alone would have the authority to make the decision, and I think we all believe that the system would carry out the order that he gave. The electorate on election day chose him to make that decision. But in the other context, where the president's waking up the military, maybe in an extreme funk saying, I'm angry and I want something done, in that setting, he requires the cooperation of a lot of people who would be asking exactly the questions that General Kaler outlined. What's the context? Why is this? And the president alone could not affect the strike, he would require lots of people cooperating with him to make the strike happen, and they'd be asking the questions that would slow down that process. And so the context matters greatly for this. Our experience is that the president has asked for authorization when he is initiating a conflict. That's what President Bush did in 2002. And I believe that if there was that kind of context, the president would expect to go to Congress for authorization for something in that style.
Now, per the U.S. Air Force instruction, the two-person concept is designed to prevent an accidental or malicious launch of nuclear weapons by a single individual. In the nuclear chain of command, the only exception to this rule is the president. Would it not make sense to require at least one other person sign off on a decision to launch a first strike, for example, a constitutional officer such as the vice president?
Senator, there's an adage in the law that you may be familiar with, that hard cases make bad law. And this is a hard case. And I think taking away the president's authority as commander-in-chief or diluting it in some respect by requiring him to go to another constitutional officer in a formal sense, I'm not sure that's the wise course. I do think, as I said, it would be a rare case where the president would not consult with all of his senior advisors, to include the vice president.
Yeah.
It's just automatic in the system, whether there's time, considerable time or not, that would occur. It would be very unusual if it didn't.
Yeah. Do you all disagree or agree with that?
I do not disagree. I think any law that you pass that raises constitutional questions will be very difficult, one, to get passed, and two, very difficult to implement. You want to make sure you don't propose a legislative fix that undermines the nuclear deterrent and thus compromises the effectiveness of why we have nuclear weapons.
And I agree with both of my colleagues that there are two different questions really at work here. One is a question of constitutional authority and what the commander-in-chief is allowed to do as the commander-in-chief, and the other is a principle and a set of processes and procedures that ensure that the authorized use remains at the most senior civilian authority, and that unauthorized or accidental use cannot occur.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank all our panelists for being here today. General Keeler, I just want to follow up on what has been much discussed here. In your written statement, you indicate the legal principles of military necessity, distinction, and proportionality also apply to nuclear plans, operations, and decisions. Legal advisors are deeply involved with commanders at all steps of the deliberate and crisis action processes to offer perspective on how force is to be used, as well as the decision to use force. So a few observations, and I'll give you, General, and you, Mr. McKeon, since you're the attorney on the panel, an opportunity to respond to any alike. Number one, it's unclear to me what the legal standard is for a person to determine whether or not these legal principles have been satisfied. So is the standard that no reasonable person could conclude that the order was necessary or proportional? Or is there some other legal standard, or is that left strategically vague? The second observation is it's unclear what the commander-in-chief's recourse would be if, in fact, a military person decided not to move forward with these orders based on principle reasons that are grounded in the legal principles of military necessity and proportionality. That is, what if a military person regards the order as illegal, decides to do what we are taught in the military, make known their decision, and refuses to obey that order? What recourse does the commander-in-chief then have in the wake of such a decision. And then the last observation is that I am unaware of, perhaps most others are as well, that I'm unaware of any sort of what I'll call discernment training. That is the training of our military personnel to be able to apply these legal principles to different circumstances, to different military contingencies. Considering legal questions in advance, to me, seems distinct from making firm legal determinations in advance. And going through a series of war games or contingencies could help sharpen one's ability to apply the facts of different complicated global circumstances to these legal principles. So with that, if you'd like to comment on any of those observations, why don't I start with Mr. McKeon as the counselor present.
Senator Young, on the second question about the legal recourse, if you had a commander saying that he did not believe it was a legal order, the chain of command runs from the president to the secretary to the combatant commander. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs is not in that chain of command. And I suppose probably the first recourse would be to call the Secretary of Defense to tell him to order the commander to do it. And then if the commander still resisted, they'd either get a new Secretary of Defense or get a new commander. But you'd have a real constitutional crisis on your hands if that occurred. I'm unaware that there's a strict legal standard like no reasonable person on the judgment of proportionality and distinction, because it's not an instance that would get litigated very often, although General Kaler may be more familiar with UCMJ cases than I am, because I'm not a DOD lawyer. I was the lawyer in this committee. It would be a judgment based on senior military officers like the chairman, who would be in the conversation, and the combatant commander and their legal advisors, all of whom would have between 30 and 40 years of military service and experience and understand how to make these assessments. I think that's the best answer I can give you.
Thank you. General, do you have anything to add? And also, perhaps you could answer the question. Of course, these would be highly classified training regimens, but and if you prefer, you could brief me in a classified setting, but about our ability to train people to discern when proportional, necessary orders have been.
Right. Well, we certainly do train everyone in the military on what we collectively call the law of armed conflict, and that training occurs probably somewhere every day. It includes the nuclear forces. It includes everyone wearing a uniform. And so this is not a foreign concept to people who wear our uniforms. In terms of what is legal precedent here, I frankly can't answer that off the top of my head. I don't know, and what the legal standard is for determining distinction, proportionality, and military necessity, I can't describe that off the top of my head either. What I can say that for nuclear decision-making at the highest level, it's a consultative process. And there are senior people involved in that process, where my expectation always was, if there was a question about legality, first of all, if this was something we had planned, then those issues have been addressed and resolved prior to the time that the plan becomes part of a playbook that says, hey, you could pick this one because we've already been through all of that for this, or this, or this. And there are many options that have been pre-planned. If we were doing crisis action planning, we would do the same thing. We would follow through. That happens faster, but we would follow through with the same thing. The same legal standards would be applied. I always assumed that if issues got raised at the most senior level, that we would be able to resolve those issues. And then, as was described, the chain of command is operative here.
Thank you.
Thank you
both very much. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing. This is fascinating. Thank you all for being here today. Let me just pull back the cover for a minute from this hearing. We are concerned that the President of the United States is so unstable, is so volatile, has a decision-making process that is so quixotic that he might order a nuclear weapons strike that is wildly out of step with U.S. national security interests. So let's just recognize the exceptional nature of this moment and the discussion that we're having today. I want to maybe pin together some of the questions that have been asked here in a little bit more pointed form. We've been talking about the ways in the reasons that an individual in the chain of command may decide to refrain from carrying out a particular order because of its illegality. And I think Senator Young raised some very good concerns around the difficulty of evaluating whether a particular order is necessary or proportional. But let me just ask a simple question. Is one of the questions that is asked in determining whether an order is legal is whether or not there is a declaration of war that allows for that military action to take place? Would there have to be an independent legal determination made by those in the chain of command that there was an operational declaration of war in the absence of an attack or an imminent threat?
Senator, you're looking at me. Are you asking me?
Sure.
Great. So the authority to use force and whether or not there's a declaration of war comes back to context here. At least from my perspective, I always viewed the use of nuclear weapons as fitting in with our declaratory policy, which is that we would be in extreme circumstances, and it was described pretty well. It was described in the last nuclear posture review, but subsequent to that, it was described in other various ways by the United States, various administrations over time, that we would be in some kind of extraordinary or extreme circumstances, and we would be dealing with national interests that are at stake here. I can't go back and recite authority that's been granted in the past to respond with nuclear weapons, but my belief, and I could be wrong here, was that this issue of strategic and tactical warning had been addressed in prior epochs, and that we were not on shaky legal ground if we were talking about response to strategic or tactical warning.
But the question as to whether there is legal authority is part of the decision-making process regarding the legality of a particular order that the chain of command is being asked to carry out.
Sure.
And Dr. Fever, you agree?
Right. One of the things that the officers will ask themselves is, under what authority are we conducting this operation? And that would require referring back to what are the authorities. They could reach the judgment that it's the inherent authorities in Article 2 of the Commander-in-Chief Clause. And so you would require a legal judgment, and there's legal staffs throughout the chain of command. What would be the case, though, is it wouldn't be the President alone persuading a single military officer alone on the other side of the telephone. There would be a large group of advisors and legal advisors weighing in on this. And that's an important part of the context that is sometimes lost in the media coverage. There would be a lot of people under the scenario that you described, not imminent, not waking the President up, but we have time to decide this. Many, many people would be weighing in, including many lawyers.
I think Mr. McKeon answered this to an extent, but I'll ask you, Dr. Fever, would the possession of a nuclear weapon capable of reaching the United States constitute an imminent attack, in your opinion? The simple possession of a weapon capable of, a nuclear weapon capable of hitting the United States, does that constitute an imminent attack?
I'm not a lawyer, and so I could not judge whether that would meet the legal test. I think it would, in most people's minds, constitute a grave threat to U.S. national security, particularly if it was a North Korean nuclear warhead atop a North Korean missile that was capable of reaching the United States. I think most Americans would view that as a grave threat to our national security. Whether that would meet the legal test of imminence would require legal judgment. And I'll defer to counsel on my right.
Mr. McCann.
Senator, the mere possession of a nuclear weapon, I do not think would meet that test. I think there would be time and required for congressional authorization if the decision were taken that the mere possession of a nuclear weapon by a state such as North Korea was unacceptable to U.S. national security interests. They have a nuclear weapon today. We know that much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rubio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I want to say at the outset, this is an important conversation, but one we should tread lightly on. Our allies who rely on U.S. defense assurances are watching, and if we create doubt in their minds about the capability or the willingness of the United States to live up to those commitments in any way, and I'm not claiming that's what anyone's doing, I think it could have repercussions that are significant, including encouraging some of them to perhaps pursue their own deterrent capability if they come to doubt our political ability and our willingness to live up to our commitments, actually making the world more dangerous, not less dangerous. I also think our adversaries are watching, and I'll get to that part in a moment, but I think if anyone out there thinks they could somehow get away with something because in politics of the United States would prevent the commander-in-chief from acting expeditiously, that could also encourage miscalculation, particularly on behalf of people that are isolated from the world, don't get a lot of information, and have never had anyone tell them they're wrong or no. And I have one person in particular in North Korea that concerns me in that regard. I don't think there's any debate about imminent attack or under attack. I think I would agree, I think we would all agree that the President of the United States has to have the capability to quickly respond if we are under attack and or under potential imminent attack. And obviously there could be some debate about it. I also think it's important for us in the context of this new posture review to know that the traditional Cold War threat of a massive exchange between the U.S. and the then Soviet Union is probably not likely in the short term. I think the likelier threats remain the use of Russia of tactical battlefield weapons to escalate in order to de-escalate a battlefield event, a terrorist organization that comes into possession of a nuclear device or some other weapon of mass destruction, and then a rogue regime that doesn't have any of these safeguards we've talked about. It's basically one guy who has a bad night and gets up and decides he wants to do something about it. So these are things that it's important to understand. I think this whole debate is about first use. And I want to touch on a topic that was first innovated during the Cold War in the context of an overwhelming conventional advantage that the Warsaw Pact had, but we also saw it operative in the first Gulf War, and that's the notion of calculated ambiguity. And I believe it served us in both, and particularly in '91 when Saddam Hussein was perhaps tempted to use biological and or chemical weapons. One of the reasons why perhaps he did not pursue it was that there was calculated ambiguity about whether or not that would trigger a U.S. nuclear response. And I think we could all foresee what that conflict would have looked like had he deployed biological and or chemical agents that he had in his possession, could potentially have used. Is calculated ambiguity still an important concept in the 21st century? The notion that adversaries should have doubt in their mind about whether or not the United States retains the right to strike first, should they either use a weapon of mass destruction and or move in a dangerous direction. Is calculated ambiguity still useful and still operative in this set of threats that we now face?
Senator, I believe that it enhances our deterrence to have some doubt in the mind of an adversary about under what conditions we would use a nuclear weapon.
Senator, I agree, and I'd go further and say that President Obama, who was no fan of nuclear weapons and who moved us back on the nuclear threat index in his 2010 nuclear posture review, nevertheless left in place calculated ambiguity in precisely these scenarios. And his rewriting of it was taken to mean we would not threaten countries who were attacking us with non-nuclear weapons, but a close reading of what he was decided left in place enough ambiguity to achieve precisely the deterrent effect you described. And that was from a president who was openly hostile to nuclear weapons.
Yes, is the answer to your question.
The last point in the 40 seconds I have left that I just wanted to touch on is this whole notion of if it's legal, you have a right. And I think we all understand what that means. You can't, a military official's ordered to go into a village full of civilians and kill everybody. That clearly violates the law that governs armed conflict. I think there's also some danger in that regard here. Now, we have to be careful in how we talk about that as well. We cannot have a bunch of bunker lawyers that basically, or activists up and down the chain who decide that they're going to disobey any order that they disagree with. I mean, we can foresee where something like that could spin out of control. And ultimately, in this republic, we have elections, and one of the things that voters think about when they elect someone to the office of President of the United States is whether or not they want to entrust them with this capability. So it is good that people are aware of this issue, but I think we need to be very careful when we talk about that component of it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I agree. I just want to say, I don't think you're here for my opening comments. I cannot agree more that both for our adversaries and those who are friends that we need to be careful in how we discuss this. We do not want any of them to fear that somehow the ability to make decisions that benefit our country and them or disbenefit them if they're acting against us is being taken away. So I couldn't agree more. Senator Markey.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this very important hearing. I requested this several weeks ago, and I just think it's so important that you have such an important discussion because few questions are as important to U.S. national security as the question of presidential authority to use nuclear weapons, not only to deter or defend against a nuclear attack, but also to start a nuclear war. Nuclear weapons are for deterrence, not war fighting. Launching nuclear weapons first would be an unprecedented act of aggression and war. Whether limited or massive, any first-use nuclear strike would devolve into retaliatory strikes and war, causing unimaginable death, suffering, and destruction. Absent a nuclear attack upon the United States or our allies, no one human being should have the power to unilaterally unleash the most destructive forces ever devised by humankind. Yet, under existing laws, the President of the United States can start a nuclear war without provocation, without consultation, and without warning. It boggles the rational mind. I fear that in the age of Trump, the cooler heads and strategic doctrine that we once relied upon as our last best hope against the unthinkable seem less reassuring than ever. In other areas of government, our Constitution's system of checks and balances ensures that the President does not have sole power to make extreme decisions without some level of national consensus. But on the President's sole authority to start a nuclear war, even in the absence of a nuclear attack against our country, no one can tell the President no, not Secretaries Mattis or Tillerson. Even General Kelly, the President's Chief of Staff, can't control the President's Twitter tantrums. As a result, many Americans share my fear that the President's bombastic words could turn into nuclear reality. The fact that any American president has the unilateral ability to start a nuclear war is why I have introduced legislation co-sponsored by 13 of my Senate colleagues to restrict any president's authority to launch a first-use nuclear strike without congressional authorization. The Founding Fathers believed that Congress has an integral role in any decision to start a war. And today, more than ever, it is imperative that Congress reassert that constitutional authority. Mr. McKeon, is the President legally required to consult with or receive approval from anyone else before ordering the launch of a nuclear weapon?
Well, Senator Markey, in the context that you described, in the absence of an attack or an imminent attack, I think the Constitution requires him to come to Congress and get that authority.
Okay. Does the protocol for the President to launch a nuclear weapon change if we are under nuclear attack or deciding to launch a first-use strike? It is different when we are not under attack.
Those are two different questions.
Two different questions.
If we are under attack, the President would have that authority under Article 2 to defend the country and there's no distinction between his authority to use conventional or nuclear weapons in response to such an attack.
Is there a formal process by which anyone in the chain of command, from the Secretary of Defense down to the submariner or airmen, actually initiating the launch sequence that may object to or legally refuse to carry out a presidential order or launch a nuclear weapon?
Well, as General Kaler has described, the officers in the chain of command, the senior officers and the Secretary, could raise objections that if they believe the order was illegal. I think the system is designed to protect the first or second lieutenant, 23-year-old Air Force officer sitting in a launch control center, from having to make that grave decision. It's really the 4 stars who need to, and the Secretary who need to bear that burden.
Because disobeying such an order would be considered a violation of federal law under the under the United States Code or the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So in your testimony, Mr. McCann, you say that in August, the National Security Advisor, Mr. McMaster, suggested the possibility of a preventive war, which would require a congressional authorization. In other words, if there had been a decision that was being made by the President to use nuclear weapons, maybe small tactical nuclear weapons, to hit the nuclear weapons system in known locations in North Korea as part of a preventative nuclear war, it is your opinion that the President would have to come to the United States Congress in order to receive congressional approval. Is that correct?
Correct.
Is that correct? So when Mr. McMaster, when General McMaster talks in those terms, preventative war, then, and that is, I think, what most people are most concerned about, this question of the President actually using them as part of that kind of a scenario. There is, in your opinion, a constitutional responsibility for the members of Congress who have to have voted on that before such a nuclear war is commenced by the United States.
Correct, and in my view, the President would lack the authority. We had hearings, not in this committee, but in the Judiciary Committee before the Gulf War in 1991, and I was working for Senator Biden, then the chairman of that committee. One of the witnesses, Harold Coe, who was later the legal advisor in the State Department, said something that has stuck with me ever since, which is silence has a sound. If the sound from Congress is silence, then the answer is no.
Yeah, well, the sound of silence has finally ended since 1976 to today on this issue, and I think, Mr. Chairman, that you deserve much praise for having this very important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your interest in the topic and for pursuing this for so many years. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I also want to thank you for having this hearing. I have a strong belief that under administrations of both parties and under Congresses of both parties' leadership, there's been a significant kind of creeping abdication of power in the war, peace, and diplomacy space from Congress to the President. There are Article II powers that are very important with respect to being the Commander-in-Chief and also with respect to the conducting of diplomacy, but there's also very strong congressional prerogatives in the power to declare war, but also in the powers to oversee treaties and other diplomatic matters. And in recent years, I think this committee has started to pull some of that power back to this end of Pennsylvania Avenue in important ways. That was what the Iran Review Act did. The President Obama at that time was asserting an ability to do this deal with Iran on the nuclear program without seeking a vote of Congress, and we felt that no congressional imprimatur was very unwise. And we pulled that back. We've done that with respect to Russia sanctions, and the current administration tried to pull back a little bit of the oversight responsibility. I've been engaged in an effort with colleagues, and the chair has recently held a very important hearing on the question of the 9/11 authorization, whether it still applies to military operations against other non-state terrorist organizations than al-Qaeda. And I view this hearing as much the same way, trying to make sure we all share an understanding of what current protocols are, but then ask ourselves whether Congress is taking the steps we need to make sure that we're not abdicating the Article I responsibilities that we were granted by Madison and the other founders in 1787. General Keeler, I was really interested in your testimony about just from a military standpoint, as somebody who's the head of STRATCOM, as a leader, your thought about an order. If a president gives an order and you would grapple with whether or not, you viewed it to be lawful. The question of legality and lawfulness starts with the Constitution. You and we take oaths to the Constitution, not to a flag, not to a president, not to a party. We take an oath to the Constitution. So clearly, if you thought an order violated the Constitution, I assume that was incorporated in your testimony. But I wonder about your thought about internal protocols. If it's more than just the Constitution, but you were to feel that an order to use a nuclear weapon, say, violated internal protocols that have been agreed upon in the military, either with respect to proportionality or some procedural protocol. Is that the kind of, just using it as a hypothetical, would that be the kind of thing that might make you decide, no, I cannot execute on that order? And then I'm interested in understanding whether there's a widely shared view of what this line between a lawful order and an unlawful order would be.
Excuse me, Senator. Senator, this issue about legality of orders exists at every level of command, no matter whether the order is to use nuclear weapons or whether to use some other kind of weapon, perform some other kind of operation. The principle remains the same. In order for our military to follow the orders of the civilian leaders, then those orders have to be two things. There are a couple of tests. One test is that it has to come from someone who has command authority. Right. And second, it has to meet the legal tests of the law of armed conflict. So issues about the extent of presidential authority, et cetera, are really constitutional issues for all of you to hammer out and then provide to the military. That's the way I think that works. And then second, though, when these issues are in military decision-making, I always had a legal advisor by my side. I think you would find that commanders across the board these days have legal advisors by their side. Secretary of Defense and people who would be part of a conference having a conversation about nuclear decisions, legal advisors would be part of that conversation. And certainly my experience with this has been that legal advisors are not reluctant to raise their hand and say, before we go further, here are the things you need to consider about legality. I think Brian's points about at what point do we need Congress to weigh in, et cetera, while they might not be at the fingertips of every military commander, they are certainly discussed in the military legal profession. And so I was never concerned that I would not have the appropriate legal advisor at hand and that legal concerns would not be part of that conversation.
Dr. Fever, I'm about out of town, but if you would like to answer, that would help me. So
the military has an obligation to follow legal orders, and there is a presumption that the orders that come through the chain of command are, and from competent authority, are legal. But those orders are simultaneously vetted by the legal advisors, as General Kaler said. But as Senator Rubio pointed out, that does not mean that every order that comes down is an opportunity to discuss and debate between the chains of command. There's a presumption that the orders are legal. And when there's an extraordinary order, like an order to launch a nuclear weapon, that would require a lot of attention and would galvanize attention. The second point I would make is you may, Chairman, want to have lawyers back to talk about what are the legal authorities that are extant now regarding conflict on the Korean Peninsula. We are still under an armed hostilities, just in an armistice from the first Korean War, and there have been multiple UN Security Council resolutions, all of which provide some legal basis for action, U.S. action, and I'm not a lawyer to adjudicate those, but I'm sure that the DOD lawyers are looking at those issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Sir, may I add one more thing to this? I know the Senator's out of time. If I wasn't getting legal input, I was asking for it. And my obligation, my responsibility as the commander of Strategic Command was to clear up any of those concerns on the behalf of the operating forces. They are not in a position really to make a legal determination with an order that is given to them. So, for example, I spent a lot of time in a Missile Launch Control Center over my early parts of my career. I had no way to know whether the target that I was being told to strike was a legal target or not a legal target. I was relying on people above me in the chain of command to carry that out, and my view as the commander of Strategic Command was that was my responsibility to do.
If I could go back, Dr. Feber, what was your last admonition to me?
It was not an admonition, but a suggestion, sir.
I took it as an admonition, but...
There have been many questions about what would be the legal authority for U.S. military action on North Korea, particularly with regards to nuclear weapons. And while it would certainly be politically advisable that the president go to Congress to get new authorization for any new hostilities, it's at least possible, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm suggesting that lawyers be consulted on what is the legal basis that is already existing because of prior UN Security Council resolutions that authorized the first Korean War, which is not over, it's just in a ceasefire, and then subsequent UN Security Council resolutions regarding North Korea's illegal nuclear program.
Yeah, very good. Yes, sir. You want to?
Can I just comment briefly on Senator Kane's issue? Four-star generals are not shrinking violence. And I can recall a circumstance, I won't identify the commander, and it was not a nuclear issue, where a combatant commander was looking down the road and seeing a scenario where he saw he was going to get some order, and he was wondering whether that would be a legal order. And he started asking questions months in advance of the Office of General Counsel in OSD. So obviously it's a human system, and the human system can break down, but people don't get to be four-star generals unless they are strong individuals.
Thank you. Senator Risch.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank all three of you for your thoughtful analysis of the issues here. I do want to state for the record, however, that every single word that's been uttered here this morning in this hearing is going to be analyzed in Pyongyang. And they are going to look very carefully at how we, the American people, view this. And for those who are doing the analysis, I want to underscore that our discussion here today is not as practical as it is academic. We all have strong ideas about the power of the first branch, Congress, and the second branch, the president and the military. The Constitution was written in a day when things were much different than they are today, moved much slower than they are today. Every time that the president has used force, he has been backed by the American people and by Congress. So I want to make sure that Pyongyang understands that this talk about lawyers and this talk about standards and proportionality and all the other things we all talk about is not a discussion that is going to take place in the heat of battle in today's world. These decisions have to be made in moments, and it is not going to be made by courts or by lawyers or by Congress. It's going to be made by the commander-in-chief of the American forces. And he is going to do that, as you've pointed out, in all likelihood with the experts that he has surrounded himself with. But nonetheless, he will make that decision. And Pyongyang needs to understand that they are dealing with a person who's a commander-in-chief right now who is very focused on defending this country, and he will do what is necessary to defend this country. So lest anyone be confused, as most people would be, and I have sat through scores of hours of arguments about the power of the commander-in-chief, the power of Congress, et cetera. From a very practical standpoint, the President of the United States is going to make this decision, and he's going to make it quite quickly if he has to. And so I want everyone to understand how this works. And it isn't a gray situation. It isn't a situation where lawyers are going to get involved and they're going to argue about proportionality and all these other standards we talk about. Unfortunately, we live in a world that is full of realistic decisions that have to be made. and they will be made. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think that's the reason we're having the hearing. Thank you. Thank you so much. Senator Merkley.
Mr. Chairman, I've got a few minutes left. Let me respond to that. I agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think we should have the hearing. But the problem you have with that is there are legitimate disputes over the power of the president and the power of Congress when it comes to this sort of thing. I want everyone to understand, particularly those in Pyongyang, that these are pragmatic decisions that have to be made and will be made, and they are not going to be clouded by arguments of an army of lawyers on each side arguing what is proportional and what isn't. Now, you can argue whether that's right or wrong, but that's the facts. Those are the facts on the ground today. Thank you.
I think that's correct, and I don't think there's any question. And one of the reasons we've passed some of the pieces of legislation that we have through the years, whether it's the Iran U Act or whether it's the Russia sanctions bill we just passed, is that through the years, there's no question been a tremendous tilt to the executive branch, and certainly still is, and will always, as it relates to war. There's no question, but that's the purpose of the hearing, and I think it's been a good one to ferret out some of these issues and cause us to think more fully about what happens during these periods of time. Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Fever, I believe you said something to the effect that in the case where you have time to consider a response, the cooperation of many strategic commanders is required to execute an order. Is that more or less accurate? Does that essentially sustain the vision that there has to be a person between the president and the nuclear briefcase who cooperates in order for that briefcase to be utilized?
I can't speak in open session about the particularities, but I will say that the system is not a button that the president can accidentally lean on against on the desk and immediately cause missiles to fly, as some people in the public, I think, fear it would be. It requires the president to work with military aides who are attending him and who have possession of the materials that he needs, and it requires personnel at all levels of echelon command, all the way down to the missile silo, to carry out an order. The president by himself cannot press a button and cause missiles to fly. He can only give an authenticated order which others would follow and then cause missiles to fly.
In the context, you put the condition in when you have the time to consider a response. So when you do not have the time to consider a response, there's been a lot of conversation here today about reacting on short order to an assault. Is it still the case that you have to have the cooperation of strategic commanders to execute an order?
Yes, but in those settings, that's where the military is waking up the president, because they are the ones who are monitoring the intelligence picture. They're the ones who are getting the warning that a missile launch against the United States is about to happen. And so they're already cooperating by waking up the president, advising him or her of the situation, and presenting them the range of options. So I would code that as cooperating with the president in order to give the president the options of making a decision.
Those are the types of scenarios that really give people nightmares. There's been over a dozen such scenarios of false alarms where there were folks on both sides, the Russian side and the American side, have been extremely worried that a major attack was underway with minutes to spare. I'd like to enter into the record an article that details more than a dozen such events. There's the famous Moonrise incident in 1960. There's a training video error of 1979. There's a case when Boris Yeltsin actually activated the nuclear briefcase in response to a nuclear research missile being launched by the Norwegians. And it's those cases that give people a great worry. And part of the point of a nuclear triad, and this hasn't been mentioned today, so I wanted to make sure it is mentioned, part of the point was to have forces that could survive an initial attack, submarines and bombers that carry weapons, so that you didn't have to make a decision within a couple minutes. You had assured retaliation with at least two legs of the triad that were more survivable. Can I just get a response as to whether that's a reasonable analysis?
I think that is, Senator, and that's precisely why no previous strategic leader decided to put in place an automated response. They always wanted a human in the loop, and in the cases that you mentioned and others, that was a human assessment that concluded this was not real, we have time to wait. And that's why I would support and advocate for anything that can be done to extend that time, whether through better missile defense, more hardened communications technology so more people can be brought in, updating other aspects of the command and control system so that there's time for the human element to make the assessments necessary to reach the right decision. We've had too many close calls over the course of the Cold War, but they were avoided in the end by wise human decision.
In some cases, yes, well, I won't go on the details, but so in the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, is it not the position of the United States that we essentially are saying we would not use a nuclear first strike against an NPT, non-proliferation treaty participant who does not have nuclear forces?
I've written an op-ed in the New York Times about this at the time. That's how it was covered in the media, but when you read it closely, I believe it still leaves wiggle room, in particular because it says those countries in compliance with their non-proliferation treaty obligations, and it leaves opaque who determines whether they're in compliance. I inferred from that opacity that it was the White House would determine whether they were in compliance, which is a loophole that gives the president the strategic ambiguity that he might wish for deterrence purposes.
Part of the reason for the discussion over no first use is because it creates more confidence among other nations that are nuclear armed not to perceive a false attack by the United States as occurred in the case, the 1995 case, in which Yeltsin activated their nuclear briefcase. Do you see any value, or do any of the three see any value in strengthening the perception that the U.S. By policy would not utilize nuclear weapons in a first strike?
I do see some value from such an assurance, but I also see some costs. And I think that is why every previous administration, including President Obama, who might have been expected to adopt a no first use policy, chose not to, at the end, adopt a blanket no first use policy. I doubt that this administration would either. If President Obama couldn't be convinced that it was worth the risks, I doubt that President Trump would be.
There's a longer conversation about the pros and cons of that, but I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the hearing, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. Dr. Fever, in your written testimony, you said that even a single nuclear detonation would be so consequential and might trigger an escalatory spiral that would lead to civilization-threatening outcomes. Can I just ask if everybody on the panel agrees with that?
I would agree with it in principle. I think one of the deterrence features, of course, that has been with nuclear weapons since the beginning is the high risk that any nuclear use will not be controlled or could not be controlled, although we have
absolutely,
in place,
and that's what helps contribute to the deterrence factor.
It does, but we have in place means to try to control it if deterrence ever fails.
Mr. McKeon,
I agree with
that.
I agree with Peter's statement.
No, I think it is that statement that is so concerning and certainly gives me pause and others pause, and I think is one of the reasons for the hearing when we have an administration where the National Security Advisor has suggested that we can have a preventative war on the Korean Peninsula, when the President has said that he has asked our military leadership to come up with plans to address the North Korean regime. It suggests that what we're talking about is a nuclear war of a first strike. And certainly the potential for that to escalate, as everyone has suggested, is very difficult to even contemplate. And I think one of the challenges is that we are dealing with a president, as Senator Cardin has said, who has not seemed to be willing to accept advice on an issue, many issues affecting power. And while I agree with Senator Risch's comment that if the United States is threatened, we want the president to act, I want the president to act in a way that acknowledges input from a lot of experts and not to act based on a Twitter post and the anxiety that that produces, I think, contributes to the concern about whether we're in a situation where we need to look at, in Congress, a first nuclear strike policy and banning that. So you talked about the importance of calculated ambiguity. Senator Rubio raised that, and the importance of that in enhancing deterrence and making war less likely. Can you imagine a policy that would both limit the president's authority to use nuclear weapons and at the same time not weaken the deterrence value of our nuclear arsenal?
In thinking about this hearing, Senator Sheen, I've struggled to come up with constructs that make sense, and it's hard to develop a principled way to constrain the commander-in-chief's power within the executive branch. As I said earlier, I think hard cases make bad law, and I think if we were to change the decision-making process in some way because of a distrust of this president, I think that would be an unfortunate precedent for future presidents. And I say that as somebody who worked in this chamber for 20 years and feels strongly about congressional powers in this sphere.
Dr. Fever?
I think that there are proposals that are floating out there that are worth looking at. There's a group of academics like myself who study this issue, and we've been kicking around various proposals that would delimit the scenarios, so it wouldn't set aside the reprisal, the launch under attack scenarios, and then just where there's plenty of time, then specifying various protocols for authenticating an order, for validating that the order is legal, and things like that. Each of these proposals raises important questions about Article 2, and so they'd have to be closely vetted. But I think there are proposals like that that could be examined and that it might improve. However, there are some things that unambiguously would help, and that is modernizing the technology in the command and control system, which is overdue in some areas for upgrade. These are very expensive, but precisely for the reason you said, Senator, that an accident or an unauthorized use would be so catastrophic, it's an investment worth making.
General Kaler.
Senator, we've talked about a lot of potential scenarios this morning. My view on this is it is not possible to envision all of the scenarios in advance. And when we try to come up with ways to place limits on various scenarios, my concern would be that we are creating some detriment to the overall deterrent. As unfortunate as it is, the big paradox of the nuclear age is still here. I said that in my written testimony. In order to prevent their use, which is the objective here, we have to be prepared to use them. And for us to presuppose all of the scenarios under which we would want to somehow limit the power of the commander-in-chief, I would just urge you to be very cautious here for all the reasons that were raised today. It has implications for the deterrent, it has implications for extended deterrence, and it has some implications if these just remain unresolved issues, it has implications for our own military men and women and the confidence and trust that they place in the chain of command. So certainly, I believe we always get better by having these conversations and debating and doing all the things that we've done throughout the Cold War and beyond. I would just urge you to be very cautious about suggesting changes to this particular system. Again, my perspective from my view was that the process accounts for the kind of scenarios that we have been talking about today. It certainly accounts for tactical warning that an attack is underway, and we have pre-planned options and the vetting has been done. It accounts for the potential for using before an adversary weapon has been used.
And I appreciate that, and certainly hear the caution that each of you are giving us. But doesn't it also suggest that it's important for the Commander-in-Chief to also be cautious in how he talks about this issue so that there is not a miscalculation on the part of our aggressors who would do us harm about what the real intent here is?
I fully agree with you on that, Senator. The statements the President makes through his Twitter account no doubt cause concern and confusion on the other side of the Pacific. They don't have a constellation of satellites to see where we are moving our forces. When he says an armada is coming, that obviously has to give them some pause. And people may say, well, what he says in his Twitter account doesn't matter. We have policies, we have the leadership of the National Command Authority, the Secretary and the Chairman. They'll take care of it. That doesn't compute in Kim Jong-un's mind, that what the President says doesn't matter. So I would be very worried about a miscalculation based on continuing use of his Twitter account with regard to North Korea, as I understand you are.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me, so as I understand it, first of all, this has been, from my perspective, a great hearing, very balanced, I think, obviously informative after 41 years of not having a hearing on this topic, and I appreciate all those, including CRS, that somewhat encouraged us to do so, if in fact you feel like you did. I think Mr. McKeon and General Kaler basically, you're saying you don't see any legislative changes that ought to be made at this time. I think that's where you both are, and Dr. Fever, I think what you were saying was really not legislative changes as it relates to the power that the Commander-in-Chief has. You're talking about other types of, they're more pragmatic changes as it relates to just the decision tree. Is that correct, after the command has been given?
I would be very wary of legislative fixes because there's second and third order effects that are hard to anticipate. And one of the history of the nuclear command and control system is discovering that changes that had been made and well-intentioned at one level producing an unexpected result in another aspect. So I'd be wary of legislative fixes, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't review them. I think there are good proposals out there. And part of the value is reassuring the American public that they have a nuclear arsenal that is well-maintained and well-guarded against unauthorized use. I think the senators are channeling some concerns that the public has about this, and reviewing and then deciding not to make a change, legislative fix, would go some distance to reassuring the public.
And there's another component. Well, go ahead. I'll let you. Go ahead.
Just to comment on what you said, Mr. Chairman, I am wary of a legislative change on the decision-making process, but the larger conversation we've had in this hearing about the war power really falls on you and your colleagues here in this body to continue to step forward and make the case for the constitutional imperative. In both the Gulf War in 1990-91 and even the Iraq War in 2002, the executive branch was rather grudging in agreeing to acceding to a congressional vote and authorization, and George H.W. Bush, either before or right after, said something disparaging about, I don't need some old goat in Congress to go to war against Iraq. So the institutional instinct in the executive branch will always be, we can do this under Article 2. And you will need, as a political body, to continue to assert your rights to make the case that we've discussed.
Yeah, thank you.
Sir, I agree with the points that have been made. I would not recommend any legislative changes at this point as well. But I would recommend a couple of things that I know are being openly talked about by my colleagues who are still wearing uniforms. And one of those is we can always do a better job, I think, in training our people who are involved in these processes in terms of where the safeguards are. And the fact that the point I was trying to make this morning about raising the legality issue is to remind everybody that the military does not blindly follow orders. And that is true with nuclear orders as well. And I think that should be a reassuring piece for the American public, and it ought to be reassuring to our allies and our adversaries as well. The final thing that I would do is it is time to invest. I know this committee doesn't have jurisdiction, but it is time to invest in the nuclear command and control and communications system. It's been, it has suffered from a lack of investment for too long, and I think it's very important that Congress be on board to modernize that system as a high priority, as well as the forces.
And if I could, just that coincides with what I wanted to close with. When we did the New START Treaty, I was a part of a group on our side of the aisle that approved that treaty, and it's part of that, and I'm glad that I did, by the way. It was the right thing to do. As part of that, we pushed the administration towards modernization. Would all three of you agree that to have our nuclear arsenal is coming down? We want to make sure that these weapons, in many cases created 50, 60 years ago, we want to make sure that if they're called upon to be used, they will actually do the things they're intended to do. And would all three of you agree that continued modernization of our nuclear arsenal is something that protects our nation and ensures that in the terrible event they're ever necessary, we have the capability of delivering?
Yes, I do.
Yes, people who are worried about nuclear war should be in favor of reasonable modernization measures that will provide greater safety and security in our existing system.
Mr. Chairman, I would use the word recapitalization of both the warheads and the platforms of the triad. On the latter, all the platforms of the triad are aging out simultaneously, and there are plans in place to replace them over the next decade, and I know that will be an expensive proposition that will be well debated, but if the policy decision is made to maintain a triad, then those investments in those platforms will need to be made.
I just would say this for the American people. Many of us have visited the facilities where these are modernized and developed, and it's amazing that some of the guidance systems that have been in existence are not much more sophisticated than the tubes on a black and white television, and we need to continue to invest and make sure we're using the proper technology. So in the unfortunate case of them being utilized, they'll actually be there for us. And other countries are aware of our need to modernize also. So with that,
Mr. Chairman, may I just for a minute interject?
You may.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to divide this question for the committee between an imminent attack upon the United States where the President has the authority to protect our country, that is and should be the case, from a President launching a preemptive nuclear war against another country. And I think that's really what is of most concern to the American people, that no one human being should ever have that power. So from my perspective right now, given what General McMaster said about the potential for a preventive war, that means that there could be plans in place right now in the White House, given to the President, to launch a preemptive war against North Korea using American nuclear weapons without consulting with, informing Congress whatsoever, by aggregating that power to the executive branch in clear violation of the United States Constitution, in clear violation of the United States Constitution. And so to the extent to which, we're having this discussion, and there is legislation that is pending, before Congress to ensure that Congress reasserts its authority to ensure that a nuclear war is not begun in the name of the United States by this president or any president. I think that's a legitimate constitutional prerogative that we should be reasserting. I don't think that we should be trusting the generals to be a check on the president. I don't think we should be trusting a set of protocols to be protecting the American people from having a nuclear war launched on their behalf. I don't think we should be relying upon a group of individuals to be resisting an illegal order when they have all pretty much been hired by the president to have the jobs in which they have. There's going to be a homogeneity inside of that decision-making process, Mr. Chairman, that does not, in fact, offer real resistance if the president absolutely insists upon his way. That's just the reality of it. So I agree with Mr. McKeon that it should be the congressional prerogative to declare a nuclear war. I think that that is something that we should just continue here to explore, given the assertions made by the National Security Advisor. And I would think that our other two witnesses would agree that if there is a preemptive nuclear war, which is being considered, that Congress does have the constitutional responsibility, although it has been left, as Mr. McKeon said, in ambiguity. An atmosphere of ambiguity, and president after president has been created around whether or not they're going to defer to our authority. So this is the hearing. This is the place. I'm glad that you are kicking it off, but I don't think that the assurances that I've received today will be satisfying to the American people. I think they can still realize that Donald Trump can launch nuclear codes just as easily as he can use his Twitter account without a check and balance that the United States Congress would be seeking and constitutionally responsible to exercise. So I think this has been a historic hearing, and I hope there is more to follow. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank each of you for being here again. I cannot imagine having a more balanced panel, a more sober panel. I think this was edifying for members of the committee, but also the American public. We thank you for that. We thank you for your service to our country and being here and your previous service in other ways. And I think there's typically follow-up questions. If you could, first of all, I'll say to committee members, we'll close that process at the close of business on Thursday. To the extent you could answer those fairly promptly, we would appreciate it. I think you've contributed greatly to the national debate and dialogue today, and we thank you very much for that. And with that, the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you. Okay. All right? Yeah.
Yeah, that was huge.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea to catch up with
It was nice working with you. member.